right, so this is a training on workflows and HR actions today. I don't know how familiar all of you are with the system and using HR actions or using workflows, but this is going to be a very basic level for anyone who has not looked at setting these two things up themselves before. So the first thing I want to go into is the workflows. So to get to the workflow setup, you will go to Company Settings, Global Setup, and then Workflows. As you can see, I have a lot of workflows set up here. There's several different types. So in this column over here, in the type column, you can see there's attestation types, there's HR action types, which is what we'll be talking about today, incidents, performance reviews, timesheets, all kinds of different workflow requests, or workflow types, I'm sorry. So up here in the right-hand corner, you'll see there's two different buttons. So there's one for Add New and then Add Default. Oh, thank you, Megan. I just was notified that you can't see my screen. Okay, I'm going to start from the beginning, you guys. I apologize. I didn't realize you couldn't see my screen. So let me start over. So under Company Settings, Global Setup, and then Workflows, that's where you'll be able to see all of your workflows that you currently have set up. If you don't have any, this is going to be blank. As you can see, I have several over here. So in this type column, you can see I have attestation, HR action, performance reviews, timesheet, all kinds of stuff in here for workflow types. So up in the right-hand corner over here is what I was getting ready to go into. So there's an Add New button, and then there's an Add Default button. Either one of these works. The Add Default is just going to be a pre-existing workflow that's set up for you so that you don't necessarily have to create the workflow. You're just kind of plugging and chugging with information. The Add New is going to be completely from scratch, you creating the workflow. So if I click on one of these, you'll see that there's an option for me to select a workflow type, which is what we were seeing in these columns over here. So this is just making sure that you're assigning the workflow to the right thing. So if you're trying to create a workflow for performance reviews, you know you're not going to select a checklist item or a benefit plan change. You're going to want to select the performance review. So it's kind of foolproof. You can't really select the wrong thing. It's very self-explanatory. So you would just select whichever one applies to you. If you are doing a default and you click Add Default and select the workflow type, I'm just going to select HR Action Request. And then I'm going to say Add. It's going to ask me a series of questions here. So with the HR action type, there are several different options that you're going to choose for the actual HR action. So we'll go into this in a little bit, but with HR actions, you can have employees submitting information, or you can have managers or admins submitting information. So you just want to select the type of information that you're going to be collecting with your HR action. If your employee is going to be submitting this, you typically just select hire. I don't know why there's not just a generic drop down here, but if it's just something like an address change or a phone number change that you're wanting employees to submit, I would just select hire here, even though they're not being hired technically. And then the approval chain is going to be how many people you want to be approving this. So if you need 2 managers to be approving it, you would select 2. If you just want 1, you would select 1, etc. And then the to be completed by chain is going to be whether you want this to be completed by a group or by their hierarchy. So their hierarchy is going to be the managers that you have defined in the system. And if none of this really applies to you, or you're not sure about any of this information, you're not going to mess anything up if you select something. You can always go back and change it. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And as you can see, my workflow has already been set up for me. So I have my start button, my approval, and then my email notifying the person who created the request. So that is going to be how you would do a default workflow. But I want to show you guys how to start from scratch so that you really know how these workflows work and that you understand it on a deeper level. So if I click Add New and I go into my HR action request, you'll notice that those questions were not asked of me this time. And then when I get into my workflow screen, it's blank. So you have a start and an end, but that's all that's in here. So the first thing you want to do is familiarize yourself about what steps are available in each workflow. So each workflow type is going to look a little bit different. We are in the HR action request workflow type, but a performance review workflow type is going to look totally different and have different steps. Well, not look totally different, but it's going to have different steps. So if you click this Add Step button here, you'll notice that there are a series of different steps. So this is where it's going to look different from workflow type to different workflow type. So here I have an approve automatically. That means, so if someone submits an address change request and I have my workflow saying approve automatically, that means it does not have to go through a chain of command. It would just automatically be applied to their profile without an approval from someone else. So then you have your approve reject. So that's going to be you defining someone to approve or reject that request. So the employee submits their address change. Someone gets a notification saying that Jane Doe has submitted her address change request, and they have to either go in and approve or reject that. The checklist item is going to be that a checklist gets assigned. The collect note is going to be that someone needs to make a note about the item. Generate email is going to be a notification that gets sent to a defined person, whether that's this request has been submitted, whether that's this request has been approved or rejected. All kinds of notifications can be set up with this generate email item. This is where it kind of gets a little confusing, and I don't want anyone to get confused about what this item means. So this HR action item within the HR action request is actually not necessarily needed unless you're wanting to initiate a separate HR action. So if someone was submitting an address change request and you wanted them to then, let's say, complete some type of a form, that could be a separate HR action request that you would then put in the workflow for them to complete. So you don't necessarily have to use this just because we're doing an HR action request. This is just to create a new HR action when we're already going through an HR action. So just to make sure I'm not losing anyone, an HR action is going to be something like hiring, terming, a salary change request, an address change request, a phone number change request. Anything in the system that can be requested and approved or rejected is going to be an HR action. So I just mean if they're already going through the address change and you want them to go through another HR action, that's when you would use this item. Hopefully that makes sense. If anyone has questions about that, please go ahead, feel free to put it in the chat, but I know that can get a little bit confusing, so I wanted to mention that. The join steps and the split steps, that is going to be if you want things to happen simultaneously. So if you want either one manager or a different manager to approve, but not necessarily both need to approve, you just want it to go to both managers' to-do list to approve, and whoever gets to it first is who approves it, then that's when you would use a split step. The join steps is going to just join those steps back together. And then terminate employee, that's obviously going to initiate a termination. And then wait is if you wanted to hold the workflow for a certain period of time. So if there was a reason why you wanted to pause in the workflow for a day or two or something like that before the next step happened, you can use that wait button. Okay, so for this one, I'm just going to go really simple. We're just going to use this approve and reject and then generate email. So first I'm going to do generate email, and then I'm also going to add a step for approve and reject. So you can organize these however you want. You just drag and drop however you want it to appear in here, whatever is most visually appealing for your eyes. So I'm going to start with the start button. If you click in the box, a new box pops up and you'll see that no actions have been configured. So when it says add action, that just means add the next step. So what you're defining what the next step is going to be in the workflow. So I'm going to say add action. And on created just means when the request is initiated. So when the employee submits the address change. Okay, so once I have this on created here, I need to say what the next step is. So I'm going to click on this edit icon here. I can name this, so notify manager of request, something like that. And then my next step is going to be for the manager to approve or reject. These status are more for your reporting purposes. It doesn't really do anything with the workflow. It's just so that when you are viewing where something is at in the workflow, you can tell based on what this says. So I would know if someone has submitted a request based on the way this status is, but you could change it to completed, you can change it to approved, you can change it to all kinds of different things, and then you can label it as well, which is just, again, for your own reporting purposes. So I'm going to save it, and now I can see that my next step has been assigned, and I will click Save. Oh, you know what? I forgot. We're doing the email. I'm sorry, let me back up. So my next step is going to be to generate the email so that our manager can get notified. Okay, so now it's connected to my generate email. So then I'm going to click into generate email. I will say send email to manager. I can say this is from no reply at Axiom. Put a subject. So we might say these over here are going to be tags. So if it says HR action request approver first name, that's going to be the manager's first name because that's who's going to be approving it. We might want to say HR action request employee's full name so we know who submitted the request. So I'm going to say that HR action request employee's full name so that their name is in my subject has submitted an address change. And then I can just say the same thing in the body. Please approve. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. And then I'm going to say send it to the employee supervisor, or I can send it to a specific account. It's up to you how you want the workflow to go. I'm going to do a specific account, Kathy. Okay, and then we need to add our next step. So add action on done. So that's going to be once the email has been sent is what that on done means. We're going to click edit, define the next step, which is going to be for them to approve or reject, save, and then save again. And now you see I'm going through all my steps. So once that's done, I need to configure my approve or reject. So you're going to want to make sure that whoever you sent that email to, so I'm sending it to Kathy, is going to be who's going to be approving it. So when this says to be completed by, I need to make sure that I'm putting Kathy in this box as well. Okay, And then I'm going to add another action. So here we have a couple more options. So you have an on approved, you have on expired, on modified, on rejected. These are going to be totally up to you whether you want to use them. I normally just do on approved or on rejected. On expired tends to get really frustrating for some people because when the HR action request just expires, then the employee's like, why was this rejected, or why didn't this get done? So I tend to not use this on expired item, but you might have a reason for it. So the option is there. And then on modified, that's going to be if you want to change. So if you noticed that their apartment number wasn't entered in correctly and you want to modify that, you can modify. I'm just going to do on approved and on rejected. So then you're going to, again, go into edit, define your next step, which for this purpose, I'm just going to put end. So you'll also want to make sure that you're applying changes. If it's an approval, you'll want to make sure that your applying changes box is checked, because that means that the address change is actually going to apply to the employee's profile. And then if there is a checklist updated or a checklist item associated with the HR action that you're doing, you'll want to make sure that that's checked off as well. So you'll click save, and then you'll do the same thing for rejected. We'll end our workflow, and you'll click save. You don't need to do anything with end. There's nothing to do in here. It's just the end of the workflow. So another thing that you could do with this, instead of it just going from the approval to the end, you could have one generate email item here for the employee to be notified that it was approved, and then you could have a separate email item here for them to be notified if it was rejected. So then if it's rejected, they would get this email. If it's approved, they would get this email, and then you could have it end. Hopefully that makes sense. So you can kind of just arrange everything in the order that you want it to go, and with conditional options. So if this, then that. Okay, so that's a very basic, oh, I forgot to name it. So this, I'm going to just say address change request. Okay, so my workflow is done. Now I want to show you guys how to configure the HR action that would be associated with this workflow. So you're going to go into company settings, HR setup, and then HR actions. So I have a couple different things here as well. I actually already have an address change set up, but I'm going to do a new one with you today. So you'll notice there's this add new button, just like there was for the workflows. So we're going to go ahead and click that. And you have a couple of options here as well. So you have the first HR action type is going to be my employee action request or my information action request. And there are distinct differences between these two. So the my employee action request is going to be things like hiring a new employee, terminating an employee, a promotion request, a salary change, anything that a manager or an admin would be in charge of doing. The my information request is going to be for the employee to complete the information. So that's going to be an address change, a direct deposit change, a phone number change, things like that. And then this HR action subtype is just to make things easier for you. So whether it's a hire, a rehire, termination, rate changes, that's just going to kind of narrow down what is available for you to include in the HR action. So I'm going to go ahead and choose my information action request and click OK. So I'm going to name this address change. Okay, so now I have to select a workflow, and you'll notice that my address change request is listed here. I didn't spell address there right either. I need to get it together today. Okay, so now you can have a screen message. So the screen message is just going to be when the employee goes through to submit this request, they get notified of information. So when you're in the system and you see error messages pop up or warning messages, that's what they're going to see with this screen message. It's just going to be a message across the top of the screen that lets them know information. So for the address change, if you said, if you want it in a certain format, let's say, that might be kind of crazy, but please capitalize all letters, something like that. You could put as your screen message so that they know what information they need to include. Or it could be instructions. Okay, so then we're going to say add action item. Actually, let's start with add group. So add group is going to create this box here. If you add an action item first, it's automatically going to create a group for you, so you don't necessarily need to add the group, but if you want to add multiple groups, that's when you would want to do add group first. So for this, I'm just going to say address change. The alignment, so if I change it to right, it would just show over here. I normally keep everything to the left unless there's multiple boxes. So if you had address change, phone number change, you know, separate boxes or different groups, then you could have some over here just so that employees aren't scrolling down a list of things. They could have it side by side. But that's just kind of a visual thing. It doesn't necessarily do anything. Okay, so now I'm going to say add action item. And then we're going to select the address. And you can see there's a whole list of things that can be requested. So we'll say add selected item. And then if you click on this edit button here, you're going to want to make sure this override security restrictions is checked off, because if it is not and the employee does not have access to enter their address, which most employees with their security do not, so that they're not just changing things in their profile all the time, you'll want to make sure this is checked off so that they have the ability to enter that information. And then since it is an address change request that they're submitting, we're going to go ahead and require that they enter something in. We'll click save, save again, and then we're done. So for HR action requests, employees have multiple ways that they can do this. So it kind of depends on you as the employer how you want to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and first enable this in our security profile. So if I go into the employee security profile on my ESS tab, there's a section for HR actions. So address change, we want to make sure that they're able to initiate that. I'm going to go ahead and click save. And then we also want to make sure that they have HR action requests, view, edit, and add access, which they do. Okay. So with our checks and balances done, I can now go into an employee, and they can go to my account, my actions, address change, and they will be able to enter that and submit it. The other option is from your Start Widget. So I don't know how many of you use these Start Widgets, but these can be configured on a global level so that each employee doesn't necessarily have to add this information in themselves, but I'm just going to add it for our demo purposes today. So they can also have these Start Widgets configured, and then under HR, or maybe the widget would be called Requests. All of these are customizable. They would have their address change. So they can click on that, take them to that same screen that we were just on. Okay, so that was kind of a quick overview. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them at this time. If there's something specific to your company and you want to get on a more detailed call to get this set up for your employees or for yourself, I am certainly happy to schedule a one-on-one demo with you, and we can go through all of that personally. So if there's no questions, I want to thank you guys for your time, but I will stay on for the next 5 minutes in case any questions come in. So thank you guys.